Welcome to the fifth installment of the Cleveland State University Psychology Club podcast. I am Kevin Jaworski, your host and member of the Clinical Psychology MA program here at Cleveland State University. I am joined by my co-host.
I'm Madhva Galgali. I'm the graduate student here at the Experimental Research Program.
And today we talked to Dr. Kenneth Vail.
Yes. I was pretty excited about this podcast. One reason being Dr. Vail is my mentor. I work in the lab. No, I'm very, I would say, personally involved in the research that is being done. So this was something that I was looking forward to. As somebody who does not do TMT research, what would you say was the most interesting part of the podcast? And I should say what TMT is. It's terror management theory research.
Yeah, so terror management theory, that sounds really intense when you hear that. It's kind of like, okay, what's that all about? But, it's I'm no expert on this, but I'll take a hack at it. You know a lot more about it than I do, but, terror management theory being this idea that we know that we're going to die one day.
Yeah, I mean, this podcast involves us discussing some of the basic questions which people deal with, and they have forgotten that we keep grappling with these questions in our day-to-day life somehow, even if we don't want to think about it, because these questions, even if they are in the background, they come screaming at us later at some point in time. Everybody has thought about what is the meaning of my life, why am I living this life, and what is things like what is my religious beliefs and stuff like that. And I personally find it fascinating. And to look at the research and the theory behind why is it that people hold these beliefs, why is it that they cling to these beliefs, so why is it so important for them. Some of these topics was talking to Dr. Vail about these topics was very fascinating.
Yeah, that knowledge, regardless of how much you might actually think about it on a daily basis consciously, it's rattling around in there somewhere, and
yes,
things happen that kind of bring that about and cause you to be like, oh, wait a minute, yep, that's a thing.
Yeah.
So with nothing further from us, we give you Dr. Vail.
Thanks for having me.
So, we'll start with this question. What attracted you to psychology? Social psychology specifically, and what aspects of TMT do you find super interesting?
Sure. So, so my entry into social psychology more broadly and existential psychology more specifically are partly the same story, and so it stems from a lifelong interest in these topics, and as is the case in many areas of psychology, research is me-search, and so you wind up, largely because this is a field that focuses on people and our mental and social lives, you wind up with folks having some personal experiences with some particular phenomena, developing an intense interest in that stuff, and then being drawn to learn more about it and entering the field in that way. And in many ways, that's my story as well. From the time where I was really young, I was always surrounded by religious ideas and, these very deep existential concerns about, morality, what's right and wrong, broader questions about life and death and souls and what happens after, next life kind of a thing. And so I'd always taken that stuff quite seriously, because how do you not take things like eternity seriously?
Yeah.
And we have a history, actually, of folks in my family being intensely focused on those kinds of things. I think most of the males on my father's side have been or are currently pastors. And so that was something that's always had kind of like a strong influence. And when I was young, my sister and I went to religious schools, and we had chapel every morning, and we went to church on Sundays and youth group, and the list goes on and on. And then when we got older, we were leading youth groups and participating in helping to lead Bible studies and things like that. And so for me, the path was that this was all, fine to take these other classes, but my path was to head towards seminary and things like that and begin preparing to like follow in their footsteps, right? Around the same time, though, I was also getting involved in sports and things like that, and so I had been doing soccer, and that was something that stuck with me from ages 3 through to college and stuff. But somewhere also along the way, I got involved in shooting sports, and it blossomed out of just a naive boy's interest in getting like a BB gun and being the neighborhood terror, to my father and uncles and grandpa wanting to redirect that curiosity and teach respect about firearms and things like that. And they had had their own time together, bonding over that kind of a thing, shooting rifles together, going shoot trap shooting together, kind of a father-son thing that my dad and his dad had. And so I was 10 when I was wanting this BB gun, and so they thought that it was, time was ripe to sort of teach the boy to respect, firearms and guns and things like that. And it was also an opportunity to have a little father-son bonding. And so they taught me how to shoot rifles, and I got into shotgun shooting and started then with trap shooting. And it's kind of like an old man's bowling club too, kind of a culture and environment. It's a bunch of old men cigar smoking, foul-mouthed, dudes who like to go and shoot guns and blow up clay targets and stuff. And if a young boy comes around, it's kind of like everybody wants to take you under their wing, kind of a deal. And so that's what happened. And so I'm from Los Angeles, and there's really only one large place to go and do clay target shooting in Los Angeles. There's not, a bunch of shotgun fields all over the place. So there's this one place. And so, a lot of people in that area get drawn into that one place. And so there were a few former Olympic team members there. And so there was already kind of like a presence for that at that range that I was shooting at. And so that wound up being kind of like the funnel that I got drawn down. And so I got kind of filtered into this Olympic program. One thing led to another. I was doing, before I knew it, I was doing the junior Olympic team, and then I was on the national development team. And then I was just like on the team by somewhere around middle high school or so, right around the time where I was having to make a decision about whether or not to go into what I was going to do about college, whether to go into seminary or what was going to happen. And so I had my sights set on that path, but the shooting sports people wanted me to come and move out to Colorado Springs and live on campus there at the training center, and be what they call a resident athlete. So you live on site, you get room and board and access to the cafeteria and to the sports psychology department and the trainers and the mess hall, and you get access to all the coaches and the field, ammunition, travel, everything that you would need to succeed. And then they would also encourage you to go to college. And so it wasn't really like an option. It was kind of, they stiff-armed you into doing this, which was cool. And they had a private scholarship fund set up to help make sure that you could go. And so my choice was go to seminary and have none of that and pay for it, or go do this Olympic thing and have everything that you could possibly want or need. And so the decision was pretty easily made. And so I went to Colorado Springs and wound up getting into college. And so I sort of thought, well, okay, I'm going to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Mostly I wanted to focus in on these religious studies still, except it's through a state school. So it wasn't exactly the same content you might find in sort of seminary or theology classes. It was more from kind of like a secular analysis of the history of religion and the geopolitics of, what was being done at the time and all that kind of thing. And so that sort of unraveled the sweater a little bit. Anyways, I wasn't terribly interested in all that stuff. Also, people on the shooting team, coaching staff, and so on were sort of pushing me to get into psychology because it's not it's not a strength sport, it's not a combat sport, it's a precision sport. So it's all in your head. And, the naive outsiders of psychology will sort of think that there's some special powers to be had from studying psychology. Of course, we know that that's not necessarily true, but the logic of a lot of the sports staff and coaching staff was, why don't you go take some psychology and see if you can get a leg up kind of a deal. And so I got into psychology. But yeah, I was totally disenchanted with it for the longest time. I was dropped out of college like 3 or 4 times. At one point, I was going to go into the military. At another point, I was going to be a firefighter with my roommate, who was a super heavyweight lifter at the time. And if you've seen me, it's laughable. But So I was just disenchanted with academics and psychology in particular, and so I was my heart was half in it, and what I soon found was around, I think, the 3rd year in, I was in a social psychology class, and it was being taught by Molly Maxfield, who's now on faculty at UCCS. But at the time, she was just a doctoral candidate student, and so she's teaching this social psychology class, and it was in the afternoon, and so I was in this interesting space where I was going to the training fields out on the military base in the mornings, and that's on way outside of town, and then I'd have to drive all the way across town to the other side to try to make it to class on time, and I was uniformly late. I was just always and it's like an auditorium style, stadium seated class, and so I would always like burst in like halfway through and it was totally disruptive, and you could see on her face, and she was annoyed with me. And then after classes, I would go back to the training center, and I'd have nothing to do because most of the other athletes are, kind of doing their own thing, and we'd wind up with a small handful of us just kind of hanging around the cafeteria with nothing to do afterwards. We'd finish our homework in a minute, and then it would just be like hanging out and watching TV. So I was bored out of my mind. So I'm talking about this with our sports psych guy once, and I'm telling him about these 2 problems. I was like, first, I'm annoying my social psych professor, and second, I'm bored out of my mind after class is over. And he says, well, why don't you do this? Go up to her and make friends after next class and offer to join her lab as a research assistant, and that'll help you, like, 1 bird, 2 stones. That'll help you kind of knock out both of these things, because then she'll like you because you're working for her, and you'll have something to do after class. And I thought, okay, that sounds great. So I did exactly that, and it turned out that Molly was Tom Pazinski's doctoral student, and Tom Pazinski is one of the 3 co-creators and co-developers of this very prominent existential psychology theoretical perspective called terror management theory. And he also happened to be neck deep in applications of terror management theory to things like terrorism and war and conflict and all of the cultural strife that goes on in the world, and using those ideas to help explain why it is that people sometimes have such a difficult time getting along with each other. And of course, this was all, in the years, and after the 9/11 attacks and in the ensuing invasion of Iraq and all of this kind of stuff. And I was interested in politics at the time and all of those activities. And so that stuff was just fascinating to me, and it helped understand what was going on in the world. And it was also applied to better understanding religious ideas and helping to explain some of the basic existential motivations that drive people to believe in things like souls and afterlives and gods and that kind of stuff, and to prize those ideas so strongly. And so, it was this time in my life where I was sort of separating from religious ideas that had, tied up the world so neatly for me previously. And as I was sort of backing away from those ideas, I was also meeting scientific ideas that were helping to explain why those kinds of things are so important, and why people take religion and politics and national identities and value systems and everything like that so intensely seriously. And so that clicked to me. And so I wanted to be part of that and to learn more about it, both for my own understanding, but then also to just contribute to the better understanding of how those processes work. And it was also just a lot of fun. The researchers that I was spending time with, Molly and Tom and some of the other folks in the lab, the other grad students and some of the other undergraduate research assistants, were all just fantastic, and we had just a fabulous time. Working on all these different projects, and so friendships were made, and learning happened, and it was really just enriching, invigorating experience. And so I decided that that's for me. And so I then also just got super involved in this research area, and halfway through the Olympic trials for the 2008 Games in the fall of 2007, spilling over to the spring of 2008, I decided to retire from sport and make a stab at getting into grad programs. Wound up at University of Missouri with Jamie Arndt, and one thing led to another. Grad school went fantastically, so that was play the entire time. I felt like I didn't work a single day at grad school. It was really invigorating and just fantastic, and everybody involved was amazing. And then wound up with a position here at Cleveland State, and things have just been going really well.
And now you're doing this podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So
life just gets better and better. Yeah.
So you have set the stage up perfectly. So most of your research is concerned with terror management theory. So what is terror management theory, and how is it able to explain to us some of the ideas behind religious, why people hold religious values, or why do they cling on to political national identities? So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So terror management theory is interested, as there are many different theoretical and research areas in existential psychology, are interested in these big, broader questions about why people do the things that they do. And so, this has to do really with the heart of like the social cultural experience of humans, and so we do a lot of things that other animals don't do. So we're sitting here having a podcast surrounded by all this fascinating technology, and there's cameras and electronics and microphones, and it's just really wonderful. And we're here at a university, and we're down the street from one of the premier health centers in the world, and we have governments, and we have churches, and we have really sophisticated ways of understanding family and friendships and love, and it's all just, it's remarkable. And antelopes aren't doing that, and penguins don't have church and school, and things like that. And so the question is like, why do we do that? And so the answer then starts with other questions. It starts to ask, well, okay, what's similar between us and other animals, and then what's different between us and other animals, emotionally, cognitively, that might lead to these kinds of complex sociocultural behaviors. And so From the perspective of terror management theory specifically, it acknowledges that first, we have some things in common with other animals. Like evolutionarily, we're programmed to survive at least long enough to reproduce, right? And so, we're very attentive to existential threats. If a lion chases an antelope, if it chases us, both us and the antelope are going to run away. We can recognize, both us and the antelope can recognize the immediate threat and run away. The difference, though, is that we have perhaps a more sophisticated cognitive ability that allows us to become self-aware and appreciate time, perhaps in ways that other animals can't. So we have, temporal and symbolic thought processes that allow us to represent ourselves and other people around us across time. And we can reflect on memories of us in the past. We can reflect on our current situation. We can plan ahead if we want to think about, crop rotations or migratory patterns or hunting as a social group or whatever. But those same adaptive cognitive capacities also allow us to recognize that, hey, there is a future in which I'm not going to be around. We can project those symbolic self-representations forward and realize that, hey, there will be a day when I'm going to bite it. And it's unpredictable, or it can be predictable. Maybe we have a reasonable expectation nowadays of dying of old age. Maybe I could get hit by a bus, who knows? But the idea is that I'm capable of understanding that in a complex and sophisticated way that the antelope perhaps isn't. And because of that, I now can experience that existential threat, but there's no immediate physical recourse. There's not a lion that I can run away from to mitigate that threat. So because there's no physical recourse, we've got to do something about it still, because it's a motivational problem, right? Just like it was when the lion was chasing you, it motivates you to solve the problem by running away. We now are motivated to reduce that anxiety from that existential threat, but we don't have physical recourse, so the theory holds that we've engaged in a psychological solution. And that's where we start bringing in ideas about culture and belief systems and values and things like that. And so the idea is that the terror management suggests is that cultures serve as this opportunity for a symbolic sense of permanence. So these are networks and constellations of both people and belief systems that offer you an opportunity to become part of something that's larger and longer lasting than yourself, right? So your national identity, right? You can be an American. America is an idea that has existed before us, and it is an idea that will exist after us. Other parts of the world have national identities that even have much longer and richer histories than ours, of course. But you can also be part of other sorts of cultural entities and identities that take other forms, not necessarily, nationalistic. You can be part of a family. You can impart some of your beliefs and values on your kids, and then those aspects of yourself will symbolically perpetuate through your progeny. Religious ideas are a very clear, response to the problem of mortality. It's like, well, hey, we die, and the religious response is like, yeah, kind of. Not really though, yeah. Right? So the essence of you, your psychological experience doesn't die, right? And so you start having this dualistic understanding of what it means to be a person, right? So that the soul is separate from the body and is everlasting, and that there's a moral code that dictates what type of afterlife you might have, and that kind of a thing, and how that might go. And there's different cultural twists on those core ideas, right? But the idea there is that that's a non-physical way of solving this problem of impermanence, is to come up with ideas that guarantee permanence, and from then you can then start to understand, well, why might people strive to live up to some of these cultural standards and values, right? So it might be to gain those kinds of offerings. So if a religion says, well, hey, there's an opportunity for an afterlife here, if you follow X, Y, and Z standard and value, then you're then motivated to live up to those standards and values, and to the extent to which you adequately achieve that, you can start to feel good about yourself. Oh yeah, great, I'm meeting this, I'm living according to the book, or whatever. Or if you find yourself failing at that or violating some moral code, perhaps you feel a little blow to your self-esteem, a little guilt, that kind of a thing, and that might motivate a reparative behavior to make amends, or express remorse in some kind of a confession or something, or so on, right? And so the idea is that self-esteem then becomes this indicator about basically like whether or not you're earning the right to permanence, at least as offered by that particular cultural instantiation. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be religious, right? It can be secular in a million different other ways. Are you a good patriotic American? Do you educate your kids, and are you a good father, and pass on a little bit about what you know to them? Are you do you have a good batting average for your local softball league? Are you contributing to their success? Does your art get shown at the local coffee shop and influence people's day that way? Or, are you impacting students in the classroom? Are you producing good science to impact the future generations who might benefit from what you learn? All these different types of ways to have some kind of a legacy culturally, so that some aspect of yourself might, be something that lasts. And so, from this basic set of ideas, terror management theory hopes to improve the way that we understand why people care so deeply about the things that they do.
I find that fascinating. So in some, the term management theory says that these ideas about impermanence, or these religious ideas that talk about afterlife, they act as a way to reduce our anxiety about death, and probably that way give us a sense of meaning in our lives. Would that be a fair summarization?
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you about some of your research specifically. How might reminders of human impermanence manifest differently in people of different faiths, for example, Christian, Muslim, or no faith at all? You're agnostic, let's say.
Oh, okay, yeah. So a lot of my research, if I can even back up the scope a little bit broader than that.
Sure.
So a lot of my research is focused on, in some ways, it's focused on these broad questions about like why. What does this existential defensiveness look like? And so if people are motivated to perceive their cultural belief systems as valid ways to a sense of permanence, what will they do to help ensure that that's the case, and that that's the perception that they have about those beliefs? And so some of that research has been focused on like aggressive, and perhaps you might characterize it as like a hostile defense of those belief systems. And so that might even mean support for like militaristic action, like literally fighting and or supporting military action in various parts of the world in the service of your particular cultural interest or national interest or whatever the case may be. But then we're also interested in sort of the other side to that coin, right? Because it's clearly not the case that every, cultural circle in the world is just tearing at the flesh of the others, of their neighbors, to defend their little corner of the world. They're also doing lots of productive and beautiful things in the world, right? I mean, if you want to have a positive and memorable legacy and leave something better for future generations, sure, you can militaristically defend what you guys are doing, but you can also contribute something meaningful and something positive and pro-social. And so there's a lot of really just wonderful things happening in the world. And so we've been interested in some of that, like why or how can these ideas be understood as contributing to or motivating things like charitable giving, or things like kindness and tolerance and compassion, creating a world where we treat each other well, and we're accepting, where we're interested in improving healthcare, or where we're interested in educational outcomes, or, a more tolerant society more generally, and things like that. And so it's not necessarily that these existential motivations are sort of pigeonholed into this track that leads to like hostility and worldview defensiveness, this closed-mindedness about your particular incantation of the way that the world works. But it can also fuel some of the more positive influences in the world, which I think is also something that deserves and sort of demands attention to as well, is that this is, coloring with broad strokes across all the very many different things that people do in the world and all their cultural contributions. So that stuff is cool. That's largely what I've been working on for the last 8 or 10 years or something. Where we've been going to recently is now asking about some of the exceptions to those rules. And so now to get back to the question that you were asking about is, well, what about all the different incantations of expressions of faith and things like that? So we've been doing some work that looks at like how this particular core motive might crop up on different religious groups' radars and things like that, and how this might be shaped culturally. So, for example, if you think about like the various different Abrahamic religions, you might have Judaism and Christianity and Islam and things like that. And so, is this the case that an awareness of mortality just motivates faith in any God, in any religion? Or is it specifically mine, right? And what we find is that tends to be the case, is that if somebody's been socialized into a particular cultural environment where they've been taught that, hey, this is how the world works, and also this is how the afterlife works, and this is who sort of sets the rules, and these are the gods, and this is what they expect of you, and these are the socially acceptable behaviors, et cetera, that becomes your world. Right? That becomes your sociocultural context and how you understand what's happening around you, and how you understand sort of the rules of the game, so to speak. Right? And so if we go back to this idea about, religions offering basically like a roadmap to permanence, hey, it's like you're playing, that board game, the game of life, right? Like, here's the goal. That's where you want to get to. And here are the rules. And literally the Quran or the Bible or whatever are the rule books that dictate, like, what you need to do behaviorally, XYZ, or belief-wise, XYZ, or the values and morals that you need to hold up to, XYZ. And if you follow those, then great. You achieve the goal. You get where you want to go, that kind of a thing. And so what we find research-wise is that these folks from these various different groups, when they're motivated to manage the awareness of mortality, like if we were to bring in a whole host of people from a particular religious tradition, say all Christians, and we randomly assign half of this large group to be exposed to maybe an innocuous or neutral topic. We might ask them to think about something like television watching, or maybe even something that's negative, but just not existential threat oriented. It's not mortality oriented. We might have them think about something like dental pain or paralysis or something, loneliness, uncertainty, all these other different things that are kind of uncomfortable to think about, but that don't necessarily involve the concept of mortality. So we'd have those people randomly assigned to that set of conditions, set of control conditions, a baseline condition. And then you measure their interest in various different, Christian religious beliefs and their belief in those tenets, right? Like, how strongly do they not just believe that there's a higher power, but believe that it looks a particular way, right? That it's the Trinity. It's the Holy Ghost and the Father and the Son, and etc. Or that there's an afterlife, and it's not just an amorphous afterlife, it's heaven with angels and harps and whatever, put all those details together. And that, this very like kind of culturally contextualized version of these supernatural beliefs. And then you also ask them about their faith in some of the others, some of the, like the Islamic twist on those ideas, or the Judaistic twist on those, or the Hinduistic twist on those ideas. And so what you find is that, well, okay, that's baseline levels. The people in those conditions will tell you what people kind of believe about all of those various different incantations under baseline conditions. Then you bring the other half of participants in, and instead of having them be exposed to these innocuous concepts or even affectively negative concepts like uncertainty or isolation or something like that, instead of that, we remind them of mortality. We increase the awareness of the concept of death. And so then after we do that, we have them all go through those same measurements. And we ask them about their faith in all of the different Christian beliefs. We ask them about their faith in Islamic and Judaistic and in Hinduistic beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. And then what we can do is, and those are all quantified, and so then what we can do is we can compare the strengths of the expressions of faith in those various different domains. And what we find is that the Christians who were reminded of mortality compared to the Christians who were not show increased faith in just the Christian flavors of these supernatural beliefs, and they show increased rejection of the other religions' incantations and all of those ideas. And so this is a process that we call worldview defense. And so the idea is that these particular people who've been socialized into that Christian context are now on this path, right? They're playing that board game of life, and the rule book that they're using is the Christian one. And if the goal is to get to the end, right, or to deal with this problem of mortality by achieving some sense of permanence, then look, here's the roadmap that we need to follow. And if these other alternative beliefs are better, or valid at least, then that's a problem for mine, right? Because these are kind of like mutually exclusive ideas. And so the psychological response then is to basically double down on your own belief system. So defend the veracity of your own belief system and reject the veracity of the alternatives, right? So not just defending your own belief system by increasing the veracity of it, but perceiving that the alternatives are in fact wrong or stupid or ignorant or whatever the adjective might be. And so the consequence then is that you can feel assured and you can rest assured that you are on the right path, that these beliefs are in fact the ones that will help shepherd you to the promised land or to the afterlife or whatever, will help ensure that permanence is indeed within reach. And so we find that not only does that happen among the Christian samples that way, but it also happens among Muslim samples favoring, after being reminded of death, favoring Islamic ideas over and above, and in fact rejecting the alternatives and the Christian ideas, the Buddhistic ideas, etc. And we're currently doing research among Hindu populations to ask that same question and find, does this also apply to non-Abrahamic traditions as well? And so not only does that just apply to the different beliefs that people will have, it also seems to apply to their social cultural interactions. Other research by some of our colleagues has found that also contributes outside of just expressions of faith. It also contributes to people's motivated desire to actually aggress against the members of competing religions and to express support and friendship and liking towards those who share and consensually validate the beliefs that you yourself hold. The Christians favor other Christians, and they have derogatory attitudes toward non-Christians, etc. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Have you noticed any differences in any of those groups, or is it generally pretty much kind of like the same sort of dynamics?
There are some differences in magnitude of the effect, like initial magnitude and the baseline effects, and that may be a function of where we're getting samples from and things like that. But by and large, at least among samples of believers, the process seems to be the same. Now, so earlier I mentioned that we've been focusing a lot in recent years on deviations from this general pattern. And so now here's where we get to talk about non-believers, which I think is super fun, because these are folks who are sort of breaking the mold, right? So everything that we've been talking about thus far is about how people are, we're aware of our mortality, at least abstractly. We've got this concept of death that's not like locked into the moment. It's not the lion is chasing us. It's that we can appreciate this, right? And so if we've got this problem that needs a psychological solution, gosh, the easiest one is just, I don't die. I live forever. There's a soul, and that's great. And sure, most people buy into that stuff, right? So depending on what poll you look at, it's upwards of 85% globally and like 93+% in America believe in some kind of religious belief. So that's a high amount. But the question then is, well, what about the other percent? What about these other people out there who are sort of looking at life and looking at the smorgasbord of beliefs that they've got in front of them and saying, well, hey, I've got, there's this thing, die, it's like not really pleasant, and here's the solution. No thanks. It's kind of like, I think about it oftentimes in terms of like diets and hunger. You've got this motivation. It's kind of like you have to eat. And here's food, and somebody's refusing it. So our question is like, why? Number one, why are they refusing this option to believe in and express belief in a religious set of concepts? And when they do that, how are they doing that? Like, what social cognitive and what motivational processes are going on to flip the switch off? And then, so those are two fascinating questions, I think, already. And then the third one is, when they do that, when they effectively say, well, no thanks, what are the consequences for that? They go hungry, right? Like, what are the psychological impact of not partaking in this seemingly clear-cut and powerful way of addressing the problem of mortality? And so we've been interested in this question, and so there's been just tons of work that's been coming out on this in the past just a couple of years, and we've been part of it, and I know that there's a ton of it that's still making its way through the journals and things like that. But it brings in all these different questions about, gosh, if people are supposedly going through all this motivation to believe in religious ideas in order to stave off things like existential anxiety, death-related anxiety, undermined well-being, if it protects you and allows you to perceive that the world is in fact meaningful and that there's purpose and you can be satisfied with life and stuff like that. If atheists are not partaking in that, does that mean that the increased awareness of mortality undermines their well-being? It causes them to perceive the world as in fact less meaningful and less purposeful, and they're less satisfied with it and less happy and so on. And so we've found some evidence that seems to be consistent with that. Although then that begs other questions, well, are they replacing those meaning systems with other things? And if they were allowed the opportunity to affirm their secular meaning systems, might that buoy their well-being instead? Like maybe they're eating, but they're just not having the delicious chocolate cake that's right there in front of them within arm's reach. Maybe they're saying, well, hey, I'm going to go eat this broccoli over here instead. And it's maybe less appetizing, and they might have to do a little bit more work to prepare it to be consumed. But it might be just equally nutritious psychologically. And so we're sort of going down that route to see sort of like how are these folks who are declining religious beliefs making that existential meaning, and what are the different processes that they go through to complete that project. And so we're finding that it seems to be involving, at least in the American context, which, mind you, that requires sort of apostasy, that, we're a religion-saturated country, and so it's very difficult for a person to grow up without being exposed to it and without having to refuse it, right? So it seems to be that it involves some kind of analytic thinking, that there's some sort of like system 2 processing that seems to be going on, at least to some extent. There's some debate about that, but to some extent that seems to be part of the process. It also, and I'm fascinated by this, seems to involve a growth orientation, in the sense that folks who are refusing one set of beliefs, like if atheists say, well, no thanks to the religious stuff, they almost by necessity then have to become more open-minded and take a more exploratory approach to the other meaning systems that might be out there. And so that's what we mean by a growth orientation. Instead of just grabbing onto something that's close and familiar and clinging to it and defending it and having a defensive orientation, instead sort of like leaving behind that stuff and going out and exploring what else might be out there instead, and sort of piecing together and patching together a meaningful secular way of understanding the world. And so that might mean that people might have to go through a few extra cognitive steps to recognize that there is in fact something that is meaningful and something that helps provide purpose and make the world seem satisfying, etc. And it might involve government, healthcare, science, family, sports, art, whatever. The list goes on, right? But it might not be as intuitive cognitively as religious ideas about, souls and afterlife and stuff like that. It might just have to go through an extra step or two to get that project completed cognitively.
We don't have a lot of time left. There's one question I'd really like to ask. We're talking about, this existential fear, but that's not the only type of fear. Or maybe it is. Maybe that fear swallows up all the other ones. Who knows? But maybe these are questions to ask. But how might this framework apply to, let's say, somebody who's experiencing like post-traumatic stress or just generalized anxiety disorder and the symptoms that go along with that? Is there any application or overlap there?
Oh, absolutely. So first of all, there's two different kind of like sides to this coin, right? So what we've been talking about so far is a theoretical approach to this that understands the abstract concept of mortality as a threat. And so that mostly is applied to folks who are just kind of like healthy socio-normative folks in a typical socialized situation, where you can just kind of like settle into your rut, so to speak, and kind of charge along on autopilot and you're fine. And so these processes are really in place to kind of not necessarily to like deal with directly conscious thoughts of mortality, but rather non-conscious, and to sort of keep the idea of mortality in the back of your mind so that you don't have to experience it. And so like most of the listeners might be thinking, well, gosh, I never think about mortality. And that's kind of the point, is that if all of this stuff is working correctly, you won't be. And the point of this is that it's an uncomfortable, unpleasant set of thoughts to think. And so most of this stuff among healthy socio-normative samples won't cross your mind. And, in effective engagement in your social cultural surroundings and values and belief systems and stuff means that you're tucked into that stuff. You're part of this legacy providing way of life, or you're pursuing, XYZ behaviors or moral values and things like that, and you feel like you're qualifying for heaven or afterlife or whatever. You're living up to whatever you're expected to do. And so that's helping shield you from, these bigger, broader issues of thinking about the fact that you really are probably just toast when you die. And so the idea is that that's like a self-protective function. But then there are other situations where it's clearly less abstract, right? So, when we're sitting here talking about it, it's a very abstract concept. I mean, we're thinking about the idea of death. But for a soldier in a combat zone, it's not an abstraction. It is a bullet that is whizzing by your head, right? It's the artillery strike that is maybe a little bit too close for comfort. Or if you're driving, on Euclid on the way home, heaven forbid, it's the accident that happens right next to you, or it happens to your car, or it's the terminal cancer diagnosis, or, whatever the case may be, where you have a very concrete interaction with death. And so in those cases, the idea is that, hey, this is now has been brought home. And so there's some research to suggest that initiates a separate, different set of processes where people are now grappling with the reality of it rather than this kind of more abstract, back-of-the-mind set of ideas. But there's also another set of theoretical applications that are suggesting that things like PTSD and those types of anxiety-related disorders might be perhaps the reflection of disruptions to our cultural value systems or disruptions to our competencies within those cultural value systems. So, if your religion or your social group, your national surround is suggesting that, hey, if you're a good person and you do X, Y, Z in life, you got a mate. You're going to be fine. You may not be, rich in some golden palace somewhere, but you're going to have a nice life and we take care of the middle class, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you're doing these nice things or you're following God's word or whatever, and then you walk out to the parking garage and are mugged and assaulted and, something horrible happens, or there's some sort of like natural disaster or, the list goes on, right? If something happens to you, it might violate that perceived broader moral code, right? That if you do X, Y, and Z, you will reap whatever reward or punishment in the broader scheme of this cultural context. And so when those things sort of break those assumptions, when they violate those cultural assumptions, then it can potentially undermine the validity of those worldviews. And if the event is extreme enough, then it can totally damage those. And people might then be left without a worldview that seems to make sense of the world, and that seems to accurately describe the way that things happen, right? You can, I was a good person, but this thing happened to me anyway. Or mom was a good person and breast cancer just took her. Like, what the hell? How could God let this happen? Or, how could we have a healthcare system that is this broken? Like, what? It ruins your faith in America or ruins your faith in God or whatever. And so if that damages and undermines those cultural meaning systems, then you're now left vulnerable to increased awareness of mortality, to increased death-related anxiety or anxiety more broadly. And there's been evidence coming out of some of our Australian colleagues' research labs in the clinical domain that suggests that some of these existential anxieties are what they call transdiagnostic contributors. So there are these underlying factors that seem to appear in lots of different anxiety-related domains, things like OCD, PTSD, some of these other phobias and things like that, where those are anxieties and worries that are kind of safety oriented, or they're kind of these broader existential concerns. And sure, they're being channeled or funneled in a particular way, like locking or washing your hands or whatever the case may be. But they might be sort of stemming from this underlying root existential concern. And so this set of ideas suggests that maybe there's what they call anxiety buffer disruption going on. This set of worldviews and set of worldview assumptions that helped to previously make sense of the world has now been violated, and it's been violated with such high magnitude that it essentially ruins that interpretation of the world for you and leaves you defenseless or protectionless.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time left. Actually, you should be in class in 3 seconds. But and I don't know if this is a question so much, but what that makes me think is I wonder how those how that breaks down across differently attached people. Like if you look at like attachment theory, like is this somebody who's securely attached who experiences something that shakes their worldview? Do they maybe not? Could that be a protective factor against, versus somebody who has an insecure attachment style, like from childhood, and all the psychopathology that could be associated with?
Oh yeah, sure. That's a fascinating question. That's fantastic. Yeah, that would be something that I'd be psyched to know about too.
So the last question is, all of this research sounds fascinating. So if I was an undergrad here at CSU, I'd probably volunteer to work at Dr. Vail's lab. But the reason I'm talking about this is, what one piece of advice would you give to somebody who's an undergrad or even a grad student who wants to pursue a career in psych? What would be one word of wisdom or something that you would like to give to them?
For undergraduates?
Yeah.
Getting involved early is pretty much the best thing you can do for yourself, for a number of different reasons. One is that you are able to establish a record and sort of learn what it's all about. Two is that you then afford yourself some time to kind of dip your feet in a few different pools. And sort of figure out which one feels best. And so, you might be able to volunteer in my lab, but you might also be able to volunteer in some other labs in the department who do quite different things. You can get a little bit of flavor of like existential social psychology from me, or you might learn about emotion regulation and aging from some colleagues, or clinical psychology and mood disorders, or motor control, and the list goes on. And so the earlier you start, the more opportunity and time you have to sort of like learn what you click with, and that's big, right? So fit, in terms of interest, fit is huge. And so, a lot of these research projects are things that you got to stick with for a long time. Like there are papers that I'm still wrangling through the journals that, in fact, one of them contains the very first study that I ever did back in 2008. So it's now an 11-year project. And so, the point is that some of these things seem like they just last forever. And not all of them do, of course. We've also done projects that we've started and finished in the same year and got into the journals in the same calendar year. But some projects just necessitate perseverance and that you build evidence. And so, one initial study done back in 2008 might spawn or require additional studies that have now taken place over the course of the many years since then in order to put together a package, a paper that contains, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 different studies on a particular topic and triangulating in on the issues from different angles. And so the point is, though, that it requires that you be interested in something for 11 years or so. So finding fit with something that you're interested in is key. But also recognizing that as an undergraduate, it's probably also quite difficult to find something that just totally fits you hand in glove or lock and key, right? Not many undergrads are choosing their undergrad institution based on the research opportunities there. So a little bit of it might involve some compromise. If you're interested in a clinical route and you're interested in personality disorders or anxiety related disorders, you might have to settle for working in a mood regulation lab for a few years as an undergraduate, and then trying to move into those areas for graduate school and your career. But the point is that, find something that's as close as possible and akin to what you're interested in, and then follow that. So give yourself some time, give yourself the opportunity, do yourself the favor of getting started early. And that's super helpful. It also, lets you establish relationships with some of the faculty in the department, and that is super helpful when it comes time to ask for letters of recommendation. They'll have, so many opportunities over the course of the years to talk about all the intangibles that don't show up on a transcript. Whether you're whether you have autonomy and take initiative, whether you're a creative thinker, whether you're a good leader, whether you work well with the other researchers, all these things are super important for leading your own lab, and they're what people who are evaluating applications are going to look for in those letters and in the statement of purpose and things like that, because it doesn't show up as an A or a B. Right, yeah. for a particular course, and so the more opportunity you can give other people to see you do those kinds of things, the better. So getting started early is key.
Sure. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. That was great.